Right, so today my search for transformational objects takes me across the water to San Francisco and for a conversation with Jonathon Keats, who is the founder of the Library of the Great Silence project and its chief terrestrial librarian. Hello, Jonathon.
Hello. Delighted to be in conversation with you.
Well, thanks for having this chat with me. And it's a chance really to maybe have a step back and think about this project that we've put on together and more widely about some of the concepts behind it. Could you maybe begin by sharing just some of the thoughts and concepts behind the Library of the Great Silence?
The Library of the Great Silence was founded on the basis of, I guess you could say, a personal anxiety, but I think that it maybe is more general than that. At least I hope so, which is that we seem to be alone. And yet it would seem that life throughout the universe should not be rare, and intelligence should manifest pretty much everywhere. And if that were the case, we should have had contact. We haven't for as long as we've been searching, and this has come to be referred to as the Great Silence. And there are many different explanations that have been put forward as to what might be the cause of this silence. But to me, and this is where I find this to be particularly nerve-wracking and therefore particularly motivating in terms of what I am doing right now, is what is known as the Great Filter. Namely, that when a civilization reaches a level of complexity that it would potentially become apparent to others elsewhere in the universe, it tends to, for one reason or another, be self-annihilating. Something goes wrong and it falls apart. And this idea was proposed in the 1970s during the Cold War. Evidently, the Cold War is still going on, or at least it's come back with a vengeance. And at the same time, we have climate change, mass extinction, and, well, take your pick of existential risks. There are plenty of them. So to me, there is not good evidence for the Great Filter, or better evidence than there is for any other theory, since we have only ourselves to look at. But there is a good reason to consider the Great Filter in terms of how we look at ourselves and how we consider our civilization and what we do today. That we need to be thinking seriously about existential risk. And I think that more fundamentally, what that means is that we need to be thinking about transformations, how we got to where we are, and what we might do now that could be catastrophic, or alternatively, that could be the basis for being able to thrive and to address some of the great problems that we face on this planet. So I decided to start a library, to found a library that would be open to all beings from everywhere throughout the universe, on the premise that perhaps there are multiple filtration events. After all, here on Earth, we're looking at many different ways in which we could ultimately all go down, that maybe beings elsewhere in the universe have gotten past some of the risks that lie ahead for us. Maybe they've figured out what to do about climate change. And also maybe we have come up with solutions to problems that they face. So why not share? Why not create a common space in which to be able to deal with our anxieties and to deal with existential threats, to figure out what to do with a risk that we seem to face as a matter of complexity and this thing that we tend to call progress. So the library has manifested in multiple places, in different ways, at different levels, as a space in which beings from throughout the universe can converge to contend with these challenges. And because I want it to be open to all, it doesn't use books, but rather objects that simply are themselves, but that are also, by virtue of how they're arranged, potentially conduits for meaning, or at least through their juxtaposition, we can come to understand about those objects the nature of the transformation that they instantiate. So I've had in various branches in places ranging from the Abruzzo region of Italy to San Francisco. I've had hand axes from Paleolithic times, barbed wire, opium pipes, plastic water bottles, objects that obviously are all terrestrial. And thus far, only humans have participated in this investigation. Only humans have come into the library. But objects that are, I believe, really evocative and where meaning can be extracted and where we can figure out collectively on the basis of the meaning that we derive from the juxtaposition of those objects, where we are freed from a lot of the assumptions built into language, a lot of the ways in which language may manipulate us through grammatical structures, that we're able to potentially come to some sort of deeper understanding of ourselves and a better sense of what we can and what we should be doing going forward.
And so I get the impression that there are two elements to this. One is that the objects themselves are individually signifiers of transformation or have been transformational in some way, but also that they're juxtapositioning, or you're talking about the way they're arranged together and between them, can also set up relationships between them and get us thinking in different ways maybe. Could you maybe give us an example, or maybe thinking about some of the ways in which we've arranged some of the objects for the Cambridge branch of the library, maybe give an example of how that might play out?
It's been fascinating watching over what you've been doing in Cambridge, because there really are two parts to the process that I think each can really be profound in terms of the impact that they can have. And the first is the selection process, the process of a public nomination and the collection of objects. And in Cambridge, having a bicycle saddle, a floppy disk, a pocket calculator, a pregnancy test, this is really, I think, interesting in its own right, because it's a way in which to understand how people are thinking about transformation in terms of what people consider to be significant over the course of human history and significant to us today. And then the other part of it is that there is meaning to be found through the way in which objects are related to each other and the way in which they potentially, in terms of their interrelationship, show some sort of commonalities that may not have been evident if we were simply to come across them in isolation. So looking at the objects that are collected at the Cambridge branch, there are some relatively obvious ways in which to think about this. Certainly, when we start to look at an abacus and a pocket calculator together, or an abacus and a microchip, perhaps more pertinently, we start to understand different ways in which the patterning or the control of elements in relation to each other, in the case of the beads of an abacus, or in the case of the electrons that are being shuffled in a microchip, that this becomes a way in which we process the world in which we live, which both has power, it has power and also has limitations. And I think that when we look at the abacus in relation to the microchip, by juxtaposing the two of them, we come to have perhaps a different kind of perspective on the microchip than we otherwise would, because we recognize that in fact there are affordances, there are degrees of freedom, but they're not limitless. And therefore, when we think about computers and computing now, and we imagine that computing is unlimited, and we think of ChatGPT, we think about AI as somehow having unlimited ability. I think that looking at the abacus is a good way in which to understand that, in fact, there are certain physical constraints on the physical infrastructure upon which the digital is based, and therefore not fully to trust the fact that the realm of generative AI is generative in at the level of generality that perhaps we are led to believe right now. I think it's also it's interesting to look at some of these objects together where there maybe is not an obvious connection between them, that we then are really we're required to think more generally about them in order to be able to come up with what they have in common. And so looking at the set of objects, again, perhaps somewhat within the realm of the obvious, where we look at the cowrie shell in relation to the Brexit coin, where cowrie shells were used as money. And of course, the Brexit coin is money as well. I think that what happens when we look at the Brexit coin in relation to the cowrie shell, though, is that we recognize how much we layer into money that maybe is not monetary in its nature. The Brexit coin is also an object of propaganda, and the circulation of the Brexit coin as coinage is a way in which the propaganda is propagated. And the understanding of coinage as holding more meanings than just the value assigned to it reveals both the rhetorical power and the impact that money can have on us that we perhaps would not otherwise realize. And this is not just true of something as blatant as a Brexit coin, but all money at some level in terms of its design is telling us something and is infiltrating our belief system. There's also within this a possibility of thinking about what sort of significance money might have, how we might use it to signify what is not necessarily considered in the best interest of the state, but rather where we start to think about the fundamental problems of money as currently circulated in terms of greed, for instance, and how greed is associated with money. And we start to think about how we can design money to counteract the function of greed through all the different design affordances that become apparent when we look at money in relation to other money, or in the more stark circumstance of looking at money in relation to another commodity that was used as money in the past, namely the cowrie shell.
I like the way you use these juxtapositions to drive out new thoughts. And unfortunately, the people who are going to be listening to this conversation are not going to be able to see your face. But as you're talking about these connections and making these connections between objects, it's almost like I can't decide if you're trying to solve a really difficult crossword puzzle or if you're thinking about some sort of a game or something, but you can almost see the connections forming, fusing together as you talk about them. And I think that's a nice way of thinking about one of the ways in which this project for me has been a great thing to be doing, because it does invite these new connections, like kind of neurons connecting across the brain. And we've had some nice feedback actually from this project, and I'll just read you one that seems pertinent to this line of thinking. I think the most valuable quality of conceptual art is its provocative release of imagination. And I just thought that was a nice way of putting some of this thing. A provocative release of imagination is a great way of thinking about how these objects maybe are interacting or allow for interaction.
Yeah, I think that it is the capacity for surprise that comes about through the peculiarity of these objects, occupying the same space. So it is, in a sense, a puzzle that gets solved through the arrangement of the pieces, but it's a puzzle that becomes more puzzling as well as a result of that rearrangement of the pieces. Because every time that one piece is moved to solve one puzzle, it creates a new one. And to me, that is a really exciting way in which to interact with a collection, with any collection, because I never know when I step into it what sort of new meanings are going to reveal themselves. And it really does feel to me like this sort of revelation that is taking place. And that arbitrarily, if we were to take any 2 or 3 or 5 objects, we were to take the hand sanitizer, we were to take the antique camera, the memory stick, and the bicycle saddle. I mean, it sounds like the beginning of some sort of a surrealist sculpture, but I think that it also is the beginning of a sort of meaning making that is contingent on the arbitrariness of that selection of objects. And that was arbitrary. I was just looking at the list here, but that then requires deep thinking about what each of these objects is and what it does and what it stands for.
That's a nice demonstration of those thought processes and some of the ideas that you're aiming for or thinking about in this project. One of the common themes that has come out for me in thinking about these objects and the transformational objects is the ambiguity around the transformational benefits. And I suppose it's a truism to say that change can be both good and ill, and an object of change will, it by definition, transform, but the way in which it transforms, the consequences can't always be determined. And there are very few examples where you would say that it's an unadulterated good, I suppose, or maybe that's not even the right way to be thinking about this. Change is inevitable. Maybe one of the things behind this project is to get us to think more clearly about what we want from change and maybe make better choices as a result.
I think that simply taking that step back and recognizing the trade-offs. It's a cliche to say that there are trade-offs, but it's something else to actually confront those trade-offs. I've never owned a cell phone. I see there being enormous trade-offs in that choice and in the cell phone itself as a technology, where I certainly miss out on a lot as a result of not having one. But I would argue that I have a lot that I've gained as well, simply in terms of the ability that there's some space in my life where I can think, where I'm not reachable, where communication is not the default state, but rather is something that has to be reached when I come home from a walk or when I deliberately set out to communicate. So I think that every object, every technology, every invention always comes with trade-offs that are relatively apparent if we just reflect on them, and a lot of others that we can't possibly perceive when we look at the thing in its own right. But when we start to look at the thing in relation to other things, then maybe we recognize trade-offs that are latent, that may later, in terms of the problems that may arise or the opportunities, that we're able to recognize them ahead of time.
Well, certainly I've had some amazing conversations with a number of different people during the course of this project. And certainly from my point of view, that's been very energizing just to have that conversation. As you say, that act of stepping back and reconsidering the object renews or refreshes those choices that we have to make and reinvigorates us to do more or do better or to re-engage with all the issues that are implied in the project and the challenges that we face. One of the other interesting themes that has recurred for me during some of the chats that I've had, not necessarily directly related to how I see the library project, but the phrase "the great silence." I've had a number of conversations with people who've been offering objects that go back a long way in time, and so there's a historical silence between us in our own contemporary presence and trying to make meaning or discuss objects that are thousands, hundreds of thousands, or in one case 500 million years old. And the great silence in this context we kept coming back to, trying to reach out across time. And I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, because I say it's not really primarily part of how the great silence informs this project, but I did find it really intriguing to try and make those connections. It was another example of me having to flex my brain and my thinking outside of its normal patterns to try and imagine, trying to put myself in a position that is so far out of my everyday experiences that it was quite a stretch, but quite an invigorating stretch.
I think the great expanse in time and the great expanse in space are in many ways equivalent. And the premise of the Library of the Great Silence as being a space of convening for those who are separated by great distances in space, that perhaps some analog is in the great separation in time in terms of the dialogue that you enter into through the object with the absent maker of that object. So maybe it works both ways in terms of how, to me, the possibility of interaction with other beings from elsewhere in the universe forces us to suspend a lot of our beliefs and our assumptions, that likewise that needs to happen through that act of imagination that goes into trying to relate to the deep past and to these objects from the deep past. So that seems like it's one side of it. And then the other side of it is to recognize that the depth in time is potentially a way in which to recognize the vast number of possibilities, many of which are possibilities that still exist at some level that we need to take into account in terms of the decisions that we make going forward. So the Library of the Great Silence is founded on this idea that we enlarge the possibility space by virtue of inviting beings from elsewhere in the universe to enter into dialogue with us, because there may be possibilities that have come about in their world that have not in ours, in terms of how to contend with problems that we all face. Likewise, I think that this can be done looking through time and looking to other points in time where we could have gone forward along multiple paths, and clearly we went forward along one, and we can see from the vantage of these points in the past some of the other paths, and potentially we can't go back in time, but we can see other possibilities populating the possibility space of the present by virtue of what might have been had another path been taken.
Again, another great example of how the way in which this project that you've set up has been formulated. It just is a catalyst for all sorts of conversations, all sorts of ideas, all sorts of jumping off points for how we might do things differently. And it's been a great project to work on. And we should maybe at this point also say a big thank you to Judith Wake, who's been my co-assistant librarian, for helping to curate the objects, set them up, do some of the photography and documentation for us. And so I'm wondering, maybe by way of a conclusion, what next for the project? What next for the library, either in Cambridge or indeed elsewhere on Earth, or indeed elsewhere in the universe?
I'm currently speaking with institutions in Cambridge where a more permanent or an expanded version of the branch currently at CRASSH might manifest in the future. Simultaneously, I'm in conversation with people in the United States, throughout quite a lot of Europe, and also in South America right now, in terms of potentially opening branches in other locations that I think will expand the purview of this project in terms of the objects, that they will be different because the nomination process will be local, and in terms of the meaning, because those who will interact with them will be from a different place, with different cultures, with different heritage, and with different problems. Even though I think we all face some of the same problems, others are local or manifest in ways that are localized. Ideally, what happens through this, and I do want as well to establish branches elsewhere in the universe, it's a bit more expensive, but even to do so here on Earth in a distributed way, I think that there then becomes a possibility of a distributed dialogue, potentially with the exchange of objects between branches, as well as micro branches that are designed on the basis of little free libraries, where they are instituted by people who appoint themselves as librarians, that there can be this broader dialogue that remains very concrete and very much embedded in the objects, which I think is so important, and in the interactions between people or other beings in a physical space, that can persist, but also there can be exchange, and there can be some larger meaning that can accrue as a result of all of these different manifestations. Ideally, I will not be the chief terrestrial librarian in the future. I would very much like for others to take this up and for others to make more of it than I possibly can. And already that's really what I've found in Cambridge with you, Robert, and also with Judith. I'm deeply grateful to both of you, not only for bringing this to fruition, but for making it your own. I think that that's the essential way in which a project such as this can actually develop, that it can grow, and that I can learn from it. And to me, that's one of the most exciting parts about this, is I'm always learning.
Well, that's great, and a nice way of concluding, because also, as you were describing your plans for it, and the idea of having branches in different parts of the world, funnily enough, the image came to mind. I know that you've been working with SETI in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, and there are images of these large arrays of telescopes that are looking out into the universe, scanning the skies. And sometimes these large arrays of telescopes can be placed around the world, and you actually get a much greater benefit from having them spaced apart and using the great distances between them to actually see further and to gain more information. And that kind of seemed to be analogous to having all these libraries in different cultures, different communities, different sizes, and the range of meanings, the range of responses. As you say, I think our response here in Cambridge has been different again to the other iterations that you've had, will collectively provide us with an even greater richness of thought and contemplation. So maybe that's a really nice note on which to end, and to say thank you so much for having this conversation with us, and thank you for allowing us to set up this branch of the library here in Cambridge.
Well, thank you. Really has been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to more.
Thank you so much.